Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath?
No.
Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton?
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Steen?
No.
Ms. Steen votes no. Ms. McCarcel-Powell?
No.
Ms. McCarcel-Powell votes no. Ms. Escobar?
Chairman, this amendment strikes the reference to Joe Biden as the center of the proposed investigation and replaces it with the true topic of the investigation, Burisma and Hunter Biden. An essential element of the Democrats' case on abuse of power is that the Bidens did nothing wrong. It can only be an abuse of power and not a correct use of power if the president was pursuing something under which there was no reasonable basis to ask a question about Hunter Biden and Burisma. Hunter Biden and Burisma, well, that's an interesting story. And I think just about every American knows there's something up with that. $86,000 a month, no experience, working for some foreign government while your dad's the vice president of the United States? Is there anyone who believes this is okay? I know we got a few of my Democrat colleagues maybe run for president or might run for president one day. Would you let your vice president have their son or daughter or family member out moonlighting for some foreign company? Maybe I'll use language familiar to the former vice president. Come on, man. This looks dirty as it is. Hunter Biden was making more than 5 times more than a board member for ExxonMobil. I've heard of that company. And so I went to read up on Hunter Biden, learn a little more about him, and I found this very extensive profile in the New Yorker. And here's what it says. Hunter said that at that point, he had not slept for several days. Driving east on Interstate 10 just beyond Palm Springs, he lost control of his car, which jumped the median and skidded to a stop on the shoulder of the westbound side. He called Hertz, which came to collect the damaged car and gave him a second rental. The Hertz rental officer told me he found a crack pipe in the car and on one of the consoles a line of white powder residue. Beau Biden's attorney general badge was on the dashboard. Hertz called the Prescott Police Department and officers filed a narcotics offense report listing items seized in the car, including a plastic bag containing white powdery substance, a Secret Service business card, credit cards, and Hunter Biden's driver's license. That is what we would call evidence. And I don't want to make light of anybody's substance abuse issues. I know the president's working real hard to solve those throughout the country, but it's a little hard to believe that Burisma hired Hunter Biden to resolve their international disputes when he could not resolve his own dispute with Hertz rental car over leaving cocaine and a crack pipe in the car. It continues. Hunter stayed in Los Angeles for about a week. He said that he needed to get away and forget sooner after his arrival in LA. He said he asked a homeless man in Pershing Square where he could buy crack. Hunter said that the man took him to a nearby homeless encampment where a narrow passageway between tents, someone put a gun to his head before realizing that he was the buyer. Turned to buy more crack a few times that week. Again, not saying, not casting any judgment on any challenges someone goes through in their personal life, but it is just hard to believe that this was the guy wandering through homeless encampments buying crack that was worth $86,000 a month to Burisma Holding. And that might be one of the reasons why when ABC asked Hunter Biden, hey, you think you would have gotten this job in the absence of your dad being the vice president? Well, he said, probably not. And then I looked to the record evidence, and I looked at the testimony of Mr. Kent. Mr. Kent was one of the witnesses they called on the first day. He said Burisma was so dirty that our own embassy had to pull out of a joint sponsorship with them. When Ambassador Yovanovitch was being prepped for her Senate confirmation, the Obama administration was so worried about the corruption around Burisma and Hunter Biden that they held special prep moments to try to get ready for the inevitable questions about this obvious corruption that the president asked about. Mr. Kent, again, one of their witnesses from the first day, also gave testimony. Head of Burisma had stolen $23 million in the U.S. and the U.K., and that he paid a bribe to get off the hook. So again, it's not as if Burisma is pulling out new plays. Their playbook is to do dirty stuff and then go and pay bribes and hire the people necessary to make those problems go away. This is why the minority hearing issue is so important, by the way. You wonder why Republicans are so angry that we didn't have a hearing to put on our own witnesses and own evidence. And you may wonder why, well, if they feel so good about their case, why did they block our ability to put in evidence? It's because we have the ability to show that Burisma is corrupt. We have the ability to show that Hunter Biden is corrupt. And that totally exculpates the president. Because there is no way in the United States of America honestly pursuing actual corruption is an impeachable offense. That's why I offer the amendment, and I encourage my colleagues to vote for it. There were 5 meetings that we have detailed that show why the aid was released. There was a belief on the administration previously that Ukraine was one of the most corrupt countries in the world, that they had not engaged in sufficient reforms. And after a number of events with the vice president, with a bipartisan Senate delegation, there was a resolution of that aid. But this debate just lacks a certain sincerity. I heard earlier my friend from California, Mr. Swalwell, say, list out all these crimes. And so if I'm watching at home, I'm thinking, well, where are they in the impeachment? That is just a Democrat drive-by to go and list crimes that you don't allege and that you don't have evidence for. If there is ever a microcosm of how to consume this day and the importance of it with the American people, it's that they're naming crimes in debate that they don't even have in their impeachment resolution because they can't prove them, because there are no underlying facts. And then I hear my friend from New York, Mr. Jeffries, bring up Russia. Russia, the residue of impeachment theories passed and failed. How are we even here debating about military aid, javelins, that President Trump delivered, that President Obama withheld? I hear them, crying these alligator tears, clutching their pearls over this notion that, Trump didn't give this aid, we got to go impeach him for it. Where was all this concern about how to make the Ukraine great again when Obama was president? You want to know our substantive defense? It's 4 things. They've never changed. I think Mr. Jordan dreams of them in his sleep. Both President Trump and President Zelensky said there was no pressure. We saw the call transcript, and there's no conditionality. There was never awareness on the part of the Ukraine that there was a delay in aid, and the Ukraine got the aid without opening the investigation that seems to be so troubling to Democrats. Everything you're going to hear them say today can be pretty much categorized into 3 areas. First, it's either stuff people presumed and had no direct evidence of, kind of their water cooler theory of the case. Second, it's hearsay. Somebody told somebody else that created some concern about the president's conduct, or it is reflective of a sincere policy disagreement about how to make the Ukraine great again. I heard all these folks come by that are part of the diplomatic corps, and they sure seem to believe that we ought to do everything for the Ukraine, but if the president disagrees with that, it is not impeachable conduct. Essentially, they're alleging a shakedown. But I think most Americans know that you cannot have a shakedown if the person allegedly being shook down doesn't even know about the shakedown. You have President Zelensky himself saying, I felt no pressure. And then, talk about bad timing. We got this Time article that comes out on the 10th of December, just a few days ago, because their theory of the case is, even if Zelensky didn't know there was pressure, there's this other guy, Yermak. And Yermak knew from Gordon Sondland that there was pressure. But the same day that they introduced their articles of impeachment, Yermak gives this interview with Time magazine, and he says, and I quote, Gordon and I were never alone together. We bumped into each other in the hallway next to the escalator as I was walking out. And I remember everything. It's fine with my memory. We talked about how well the meeting went. That is all we talked about. So here they are, with no crime, with no victim, with no witnesses, with no knowledge of any shakedown, and yet they proceed. To accept the Democrats' theory of the case, you got to believe that the Ukrainians are lying to us. You got to believe when they say there's no conditionality, no pressure, nothing wrong, that they're so weak and they're so dependent on the United States that we can't believe a word they say. Well, again, where were you during the Obama administration when this weak ally didn't get javelins that were then withheld? I support the Jordan Amendment because this Article 1, this abuse of power that they allege in the impeachment theory, is a total joke. They have to say abuse of power because they don't have evidence for obstruction. They have to say abuse of power because they have no evidence for bribery or treason. They have to say abuse of power because all those specific crimes that the gentleman from California named cannot be supported by the evidence. This is sort of the Rorschach ink blot test theory of impeachment, so that the country can stare at the ink blot and everybody can see what I guess they want to see. This notion of abuse of power is the lowest of low energy impeachment theories. Heck, I don't know any political party that doesn't think when the other side's in the White House that they abuse power, they do too much. I got a lot of constituents that think Barack Obama abused his power, but you know what? We didn't do this to the country. We didn't put him through this nonsense and this impeachment. You all set the standard. We didn't set it. You said this would have to be bipartisan, compelling, and overwhelming. It ain't that.
This amendment strikes Article 1 because Article 1 ignores the truth. 4 facts, 5 meetings. We've talked about it now for 3 months. We've known that there have been 4 facts that have not changed, will not change, will never change, and we've known it since September 25th when the call transcript was released. The call transcript shows no quid pro quo. What's interesting is the day the transcript came out, even Chairman Nadler said there was no quid pro quo in the call transcript. We know, second, that the 2 individuals on the call, President Zelensky, President Trump, have both said no pressure, no pushing, no linkage whatsoever between security assistance money and any type of announcement of an investigation. We know that the Ukrainians knew at the time of the call, didn't know at the time of the call that the aid had been held up. And most importantly, we know the Ukrainians took no action, no start of an investigation, no promise to start an investigation, no announcement on CNN, via tweet, no announcement whatsoever that there was going to be any type of investigation into Burisma or the Bidens to get the aid released. Those 4 facts have never changed. Second, 5 key meetings that took place between July 18th when the aid was paused, September 11th when the aid was released. 5 key meetings. We have the phone call, July 25th, which you just described. Second, the very next day, we have Ambassadors Volker, Sondland, Taylor meeting with President Zelensky. Third, Ambassador Bolton met with President Zelensky on August 29th. Fourth, Vice President Pence met with President Zelensky on September 2nd. And fifth, on September 5th, we have bipartisan Senator Johnson, Senator Murphy meeting with President Zelensky. In none of those 5 meetings, none, did linking dollars, security assistance dollars, to an investigation come up. Never came up. And you would think in the last 2, after they knew on August 29th via the Politico article that they knew the aid was held, you would think it would come up in those last 2 meetings, but it didn't come up. 4 facts, 5 meetings have never changed. Article 1 in this resolution ignores the truth, it ignores the facts, it ignores what happened and what has been laid out for the American people over the last 3 weeks. So I hope this committee will come to its senses, that it'll adopt the amendment and strike Article 1 from the resolution. I don't know how many times I've heard this. Democrats talk about this one sentence the president said in the now famous call transcript with President Zelensky. I would like you to do us a favor, though. The Democrats don't read the plain language. In fact, your star professor witness who was here last week, she talked about this being the royal we. She read the sentence the way you guys always try to portray the sentence. She said it was, I would like you to do me a favor, though. That's not what it says. It says, I would like you to do us a favor, though, because, and guess what the next 2 words are? Guess what the next 2 words are? Because our country, not because I. President doesn't say, I would like you to do me a favor, though, because I've been through a lot. He doesn't say that. It's very clear. I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot. And that is the understatement of the year. Heck yeah, our country's been through a lot. This is the day after Bob Mueller sat in front of this committee, and we learned that there was nothing there. But 2 years, he put our country through all kinds of turmoil because of you guys. That's what the president's pointing out, because in the end of this paragraph, he references Bob Mueller. That's what he's talking about. Heck yeah, our country had been through a lot, and the president was pretty ticked about it. He wanted to find out what was going on. That's very legitimate. That is working on behalf of the American people. But again, as I said last night, you guys don't respect the 63 million people who voted for this guy. That's why the Speaker of the House called the president an imposter. That's what's wrong. I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot.
It just continues to amaze me how corrupt, how unfair this process has been from the start. I mean, for goodness sakes, you had 17 out of 24 of my Democratic colleagues that have already voted on the House floor to continue with articles of impeachment. It was Mr. Green who put a resolution on the floor, articles of impeachment. It was July 17th. And then there was a vote to table it. And they voted against the tabling, meaning they wanted to go ahead with articles of impeachment. That was even before the July 25th call. I mean, come on. This is a predetermined. You guys have been wanting to impeach this president since he got elected.
We're here because of fraud, not by the president, but from within the Department of Justice. And I realize people on the other side of the aisle have been so busy trying to find some kind of charge, criminal charge to bring against the president, none of which worked, that they may not have been aware of the most recent Horowitz report. But it is clear now that the whole investigation that has brought us here, with crime after crime being alleged and then having to be dropped, was a fraudulent effort before the FISA court to have a surveillance warrant done against Carter Page. They lied initially, said that he was a Russian agent when actually he had been used by the CIA as a spy against Russia. And so they lied. It was fraudulent, and there hopefully will be people that will answer for their crimes and their fraud in the Department of Justice in the days to come, and it sounds like that should be the case. And there was fraud all the way through. But for 3 years, we had been hearing about the crimes of the candidate Trump and then the crimes of President Trump. And we come now today based on the initial fraud that got this whole impeachment stuff started. And no one on the other side is willing to acknowledge the fraud that brought us here, nor the fact that so many people here have been screaming about the president's crimes. And we're even hearing today, like we just did, oh yes, there were crimes. Well, then why aren't they in this impeachment document? It's because they don't exist. They've been disproven over and over and over again. And that's why the gentleman's amendment is so well taken. You don't want to go down this ground. I think it's a bad idea when it was proposed before. High crimes and misdemeanors, if it's not treason, right? Even misdemeanors are crimes. And so we've had to drop the fraud of all the crimes being alleged, people saying in here and in the public, gee, we're going to get the president because he colluded with Russia. How terrible was that? Well, that's all been disproved and dropped. So now we were left with bribery and extortion, and now those had to be dropped because there were no crimes. And I appreciate the gentleman bringing up crimes, but those are not alleged here. And so let me just say, this is a day that will live in infamy for the Judiciary Committee. The days of exemplary chairs like Daniel Webster when he stood for principle, those are going to be gone because this became a tool of the majority to try to use taxpayer funds to defeat a president. And by the way, the Ken Starr report, 36 boxes, he came in and testified. We were kept out of hearing the witnesses. There were, in the Watergate, these witnesses testified on television. It was public. It was not a star chamber like the Schiff chamber became.
The OMB letter walks through the entire process behind this temporary delay. First, the money was paused, but DOD was permitted to engage in all of the activities short of obligation necessary to ensure that DOD would not be precluded from obligating the funds prior to the expiration. The money was paused, according to the letter, pending a policy decision. And what was the policy decision? Your two witnesses, Fiona Hill and David Hale, testified that there was an ongoing global review of foreign assistance generally to ensure any program receiving funds were actually worthy beneficiaries of our assistance, that the programs made sense, etc. Mr. Hale further testified that the president's skeptical views on foreign assistance guided the Foreign Affairs Review. In fact, the only direct evidence for the reasons for the pause comes from OMB official Mark Sandy, who testified that he learned in September that the pause was related to, quote, the president's concern about other countries contributing more to Ukraine, close quote. He explained how OMB received requests for information on what other countries were contributing to Ukraine, which OMB provided in the first week of September. The aid was released, of course, on September 11th. So Democrats want to impeach the president for trying to ensure that taxpayer funds are spent efficiently and responsibly. Democrats have accused his president of a myriad of things, including violation of the Impoundment Control Act, which prohibits the executive from essentially pocket vetoing funds appropriated by Congress. This letter that I'm trying to introduce shows instead that the administration never intended or actually violated the law. In fact, it shows that they always intended to disperse the funds. That is why DOD was permitted to engage in all activities in preparation for the delivery of the aid. You've not made your case again. The OMB letter walks through at great length the history behind programmatic delays. I'm sure this would be boring to my friends on the other side, since it technocratically destroys their central theory for impeachment. In the letter, the OMB General Counsel said even with the temporary withholding, the Department of Defense was able to obligate about 84% of the $250 million before the end of the fiscal year on September 30th. In the last year of the Obama administration, it was only 79%. More recently, in 2018, it was 83%. In 2017, 91%. Let's get back to it. The specific language of the Appropriations Authority says, for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, it's hereby, $250 million is hereby appropriated to remain available until September 30th, 2019. That's point one, to remain available until September 30th, 2019. When we authorize funds, we give the administration a deadline. The administration complied with that deadline. The administration acted completely and totally within the bounds of the law. Secondly, the OMB's letter now definitively destroys the insinuation that the president chose to delay for malicious or corrupt purposes. The bottom line is the aid was lawfully delayed and lawfully delivered. And that means that this entire process has been a sham. And with that, I'm going to address a couple of issues that I heard. I heard one of my colleagues on the other side say not too long ago that the president should come in and prove his own innocence. Think about what that does. Come in and prove your own innocence. First of all, that is antithetical to the Anglo-American judicial process. It's antithetical to the constitutional, and the Constitution, particularly the Bill of Rights. It's antithetical to what we do here. Someone said that Vindman complaining about the transcript, but has been gone over today. The transcript was complete and accurate, according to Mr. Vindman. Someone said, and I would ask this of my colleagues, under the standard that was given earlier by one of my colleagues, if the president exercised executive privilege and requested a declaratory judgment from a court, if the privilege was upheld, would you undertake then to impeach the judge? I mean, think about that. Your standard giving absolute process authority to the House would impel you to impeach a judge who sustained a lawful exercise of the privilege of the executive. So I think, Mr. Chairman, you've overgone your bounds, and when we get back to this, my amendment, it basically covers and sets forth clearly what the holding or the pause of the Ukrainian aid was about, and they got their money and they got it on time.
There's a lot about David Holmes I would say, but what I would say first is that for a guy who heard part of one half of a 3-minute phone call, he had a 40-minute opening statement. And Sondland testified that Biden was never linked in his mind until the transcript was released at the end of August. And the Democratic report does not the Republican report, the Democratic report does not establish any linkage between the announcement or understanding of investigations for his personal political benefit. The only testimony Democrats rely on to prove that allegation is Ambassador Sondland's testimony. However, they conveniently leave out the most crucial aspect of the ambassador's testimony, and that is, after being questioned, he only presumed the linkage. In fact, he admitted in his public testimony that no one in the world told him there was any linkage. But this is the basis for the Democrats' Article 1. But I want to go to a little broader reason of why we should accept Mr. Jordan's amendment. A Democratic senator was quoted saying, "Never, in my view, had America been led by such a dangerous head of state. He bemoaned that America was misled by a reckless and arrogant president." That was Senator Robert Byrd from West Virginia describing George W. Bush. Ronald Reagan was accused of abuse of power for pushing a growth-based economic agenda, for committing troops to Lebanon, or for turning back the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Clinton, excluding the impeachment, was accused of abusive accusations for an Asia fundraising scandal. 4 dozen donors were arrested. Aides getting sweetheart appointments, use of the FBI to dig up dirt on political employees, Waco, and a Swedish slush fund. George W. Bush was accused of abuse of power for domestic spying, an energy task force controversy, Presidential Records Act, steel tariffs, the Iraq war, and NSA overreach. Obama's IRS engaged in politically motivated targeting of charitable groups. Fast and Furious gun running scandal, collected telephone records on AP journalists without a warrant. The seizure of private property under the guise of environmental protection. The problem we're running into, which is going to last far longer than today and far longer to this Congress, is this will become the new normal. Every one of those things I mentioned had reports written about them. They probably had election consequences. There were hearings held. Do you know what they didn't have? A nebulous, ambiguous charge of abuse of power. If you cannot prove an underlying crime, you do not get to use all of the evidence you're presenting forward. This will continue. This will move forward. In the history of our country, the party who is not in the White House has accused the White House of abuse of power. It started 200 years ago. It will continue into the future, except now, congratulations. It will be impeachment every single time one party controls the House of Representatives and the other party is in the White House.
Last night and today we've heard many times my colleagues on the other side saying the facts of this are not contested, but you know they are. They really are. An example is one just pointed out, highlighted by my colleague from Louisiana just a moment ago. On the telephone call, listening, of the 17 witnesses that came in, only 3 actually listened in on the phone call. But each one of them have contradictory testimony. And so even the 3 witnesses that heard the call conflicted. And why is that important? Why did I bring that up? Yeah. I bring it up because of this. Many of my colleagues, in fact, most of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, take every inference in the light most negative to the President of the United States. That's because there's an animus there that has been manifest since November 9th, 2016, the day after he was elected. And so, having watched this procedure closely on the heels of the other procedures and the attempts to impeach this president and investigate, I am left wondering, you want every inference to go against the president? Why should the American public give you any inference of credibility? The reality is, when my colleague from California was talking about the Russian issue, not a single American was indicted for conspiring with Russia to influence the elections. Not one. He still believes that there was some kind of collusion with the Trump campaign. Well, what do the facts actually get to? So when my colleague just talked about the money was released, the aid was released, again, he takes this inference based on a timeline, and he's citing rank hearsay. A guy comes in and says, hey, you know what? I overheard this conversation. I'm in a restaurant. Actually, we were sitting on a patio at a restaurant, lots of people around. But boy, I could hear everything. I knew who it was. I knew what was said. And so I was so concerned about it, I didn't tell anybody. I came in once this really got going and revved up. You want to take every inference against the president. Why should we give you any inference of credibility? The only direct evidence in this case remains the same after all this time. No pressure. No pressure in the phone call. Mr. Zelensky has said that repeatedly. He has said that. He spent 8 hours in one press conference all day long talking about no pressure. There's no pressure. Yermak said there was no pressure. Are they lying? No, but we know the whistleblower was lying. We know that Mr. Schiff was lying. Mr. Schiff came out the day before and said 8 times the president put direct pressure on the Ukrainians. Oops, the transcript's released. Not true. That would be the facts being contested, absolutely. We know that there was no conditionality. Everybody said there's no conditionality. Everybody that participated, everybody listened. Ukraine was unaware of the hold, so how can you leverage them? They were unaware of the hold. And there was never any investigation. But what happened? What triggered it? You have high-ranking U.S. officials going to the Ukraine, meeting with them, convinced the president. You have the president of Ukraine signing 2 pieces of legislation reinstituting the anti-corruption tribunal and also removing immunity from prosecution of the legislative branch in the Ukraine. Significant anti-corruption measures worthy of convincing this president that, yes, they're worth a chance. And so with that, you have nothing. Your credibility is in tatters, quite frankly.
The biggest difference in the Clinton impeachment and this one is that President Clinton committed a crime, perjury. This president isn't even accused of committing a crime. The Constitution is pretty clear on what constitutes an impeachable offense: treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. It's not treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors, or whatever else Nancy Pelosi and Adam Schiff deem impeachable. Now, I think we can all agree that no president should abuse the powers of his or her office, just like the chairman of a House committee shouldn't abuse the powers of his office to obtain and publish the phone records of the president's personal attorney, a member of the media, and the ranking member of that same committee. But that doesn't make alleged abuse of power a high crime or misdemeanor. In their newly authored memo on constitutional grounds for impeachment, the majority on this committee goes to great lengths to explain why abuse of power is an impeachable offense, specifically mentioning it was one of the charges against both Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton. What they don't mention is that the House of Representatives has never adopted alleged abuse of power as a charge in a presidential impeachment. Why? because there's no criminal statute describing what alleged abuse of power actually is. Abuse of power is therefore a vague, ambiguous term open to the interpretation of every individual. Because abuse of power lacks a concise legal definition, there's a higher burden of proof on those pursuing such a charge to show the actions of the president rise to the level of impeachment. I believed that Bill Clinton had abused the power of his office, but we failed to convince our colleagues in the House, and that particular charge was rejected by the full House. In this case, the evidence provided is less convincing. In fact, I'd argue it's non-existent. First, there was no quid pro quo. Second, it's a widely known fact that Ukraine is one of the most corrupt countries on the planet. It's why Congress required the administration to certify that the Ukrainian government had taken steps to clean up corruption before military aid could be provided to the country. President Trump was well aware of that fact and quite skeptical of giving Ukraine foreign aid long before the now famous July 25th phone call. Third, Ukraine actually received the aid after the president was satisfied that Ukraine had taken meaningful steps to address corruption, which again is an obligation required by law. Based on the actual facts of this case, as opposed to the hearsay and innuendo compiled by the Intelligence Committee, it's clear that no abuse of power ever took place, and there certainly isn't enough evidence to support an article of impeachment. Mr. Chairman, as you well know, there's another significant difference between the abuse of power charges against Nixon and Clinton and those presented here. In the Nixon and Clinton impeachments, abuse of power was a tacked-on charge, far less important in those cases than the actual high crimes charged against both of them. Here, it's the main thrust of the House Democrats' entire case. Let me put it another way. The entire argument for impeachment in this case is based on a charge that is not a crime, much less a high crime, and that has never been approved by the House of Representatives in a presidential impeachment before, ever in history. If that's the best you got, you wasted a whole lot of time and taxpayer dollars, all because so many of you, Mr. Chairman, hate this president. And one last thing. I guess we now know why Nancy Pelosi was focus grouping bribery as a potential charge, because she was desperately searching for a crime, any crime, to justify this sham impeachment. But that effort was abandoned because she knows, most members of Congress know, and now the American people know, there simply wasn't a crime committed here, and there shouldn't be an impeachment here either. Relative to that phone call that our president, President Trump, had with the president of Ukraine, the number of people that were listening in on this phone call, and is that in the national interest of our country? It's incredible how many people, you think our president's talking to their president, you got all these people listening in, and if they are listening in, shut up about it. You know, the president is talking frankly with another president. You know, he's going to make comments. In that call, he made some disparaging comments relative to another important ally of ours, Germany, and Angela Merkel. It's not particularly helpful to have them say, hear our president saying something like, well, they'll give you lip service about coming to your defense and giving you aid, but they really won't be there for you. We will be here, you know, talking about how important the United States is and an ally. Our presidents do that, but you know, you think you're doing that in confidence with the other country, not having everybody else listening in. So our State Department, the executive branch, and many others need to tighten up these phone calls for our national security interests, and that goes whether we have a Republican administration, as we do right now, or a Democratic administration, as we have maybe decades down the road.
As a prosecutor, I'm just so amazed at what the majority are calling facts. They keep talking about the facts and the evidence. Well, their evidence is in dispute because it's based on hearsay, opinion, and speculation. These are not facts. This is testimony about what somebody thought or what somebody concluded from acts taken by members of the administration. The charge is abuse of power, but what the majority is really upset about is the fact that the president and the administration is exercising its power under the Constitution. It's authorized powers For example, the president's authority to set foreign policy and fire, for example, an ambassador is not a smear on an official. It's the use of Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution. The president is authorized by statute to put a stop on the distribution of funds. The president is instructed in the NDAA to ask for and monitor investigations into corruption in the Ukraine. When you talk about direct testimony from individuals like Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and Mr. Morrison, you have the fact that they were on the call, and the transcript speaks for itself, but you have opinions and conclusions after that. And when it comes to actual testimony that hasn't been heard, it just shows that the majority really doesn't have any interest in getting to the bottom of this question, because if they did care about actually finding out facts, they would be calling Mr. Yermak back into this committee. They would be delaying this process, because what we have read from this article in Time magazine is incredible and exculpatory and, quite frankly, a bombshell. When you have specific rejection of claims made by Ambassador Sondland that he was told the aid to Ukraine would not be released unless investigations were launched, why is he not in here? When asked if he thought there was a connection between the aid and the investigations, Yermak stated, "We never had that feeling." He added that we had a clear understanding that the aid had been frozen. We honestly said, okay, that's bad, what's going on here? We were told they would figure it out, and after a certain amount of time, the aid was unfrozen. We didn't have the feeling that this aid was connected to any one specific issue. If you ignored this evidence and you were in a court case, you would lose your law license for allowing a case to go forward without this exculpatory evidence being provided to the defense. It is just so ridiculous to me that we are not taking time to look further into this.
I have now given the article that the gentleman from California wants admitted, again, perpetrating the falsehood that people were killed because of money. And in the own article, which is biased against the president, biased against the whole situation, it has this line: although there is no way to link Markov and the other dozen's death directly to the lack of aid. Yeah, let's keep putting stuff in here that proves your pathetic argument. The article itself, which is biased against the president, actually says there's no way to link it, but yet we're doing it every time in here. Keep giving them. I'll keep accepting them. Wonderful article. Great job. Because you're making my point. I guess I could hush and just let you make my point for me. But all you want to do is to smirk the dead and go after Mr. Zelensky as weak and powerless. That's what's going to come out of this. So I guess, I would draw my objection on this. It makes my point. Y'all have any more you want to put in? Keep going. But smirking and dead is not going to get you anywhere.
This amendment makes a minor change in certain places where the underlying resolution refers to Donald J. Trump. The amendment refers to Donald John Trump. Otherwise, it makes no changes to the resolution. I urge all of my colleagues to support it. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for any comments he may have on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment nature of a substitute is absolutely irrelevant. Actually, taking Donald J. Trump and making it Donald Trump, John Trump, just simply shows the, frankly, absurdity of where we're at. And today we're going to spend plenty of time for you listening. We're going to talk about this amendment nature substitute. We're going to talk about the factual basis that have absolutely no factual underpinning to impeach this president. But I'm going to go back for just a minute, since I didn't have time and had to sit through a well-rehearsed, many days put together explanation on why what will be known in 2019, outside of the fact that this committee finally accomplished its goal after the chairman stated he wanted to since November of last year, impeach this president. What will be known by this committee from here on out is that this committee has now sounded the death of minority rights in this committee. This committee has become nothing but a rubber stamp. This committee is amazingly now on such a clock and calendar process that they don't care. Facts be damned. They don't care. They don't care that we had one witness out of 3. When I asked for a second witness, I was told I couldn't, even though there had been staff conversations well before. I was told I was asking too late. One witness out of 2 panels, that's all we had of fact witnesses. This is a just travesty and a sham from day one. I could talk till I'm blue in the face, but nobody on the majority cares. But the spot that is left by what has just happened will resonate over the years. It will resonate over the years in the sense that there is no fact that we can come to. They had no desire to hear any fact witnesses outside of their own train-driven clock calendar impeachment. For the chairman himself, who vehemently fought for minority hearing days, to sit there and read that is an amazing statement and a crushing blow to this committee. There's no way to recover from that. In fact, there may be. I wonder if the chairman would join me in making sure that the Rules Committee next week, they don't waive the point of order against this. But I know they will. That's why they're going to take it. Because I'll guarantee you, when you look into it further, this point of order would be sustained against these impeachment articles, so they're going to have to waive them next week. Watch and see. They will waive this point of order and waive any other point of order on these articles by the time it comes to the floor. For some of you may say, the ranking member talks about process. The ranking member talks about process. The ranking member talks about process, never the foundation. Believe me, we will inundate you with the facts, and I have already. Some of you just don't choose to report them. What is important, and for many who report on this body, and for many who have sat in this body, and for those who have served in this body, the members who have gone before, and the people who have set this committee up, and the people who have set our Congress up, are the ones right now that should be hanging their head in shame. We had 2 hearings, none of which featured fact witnesses. There's not a Democrat in this room that should be happy about this. The solemnity should be on the death of this committee's process and procedures. Don't give me the solemnity about impeaching a president. You've been wanting to do that for a long time. You ought to take it and just rejoice. Go at it, because this is what you wanted. But when it comes to the hearing, when it comes to the minority rights, when it comes to one that in which we have seen time after time after time, in which I have had to write this chairman multi-page letters on the abuse of procedural issues in this committee, this is a travesty. Write about it if you want, talk about it if you want, but the American people see it, because the American people understand inherently fairness. They understand due process. Why? Because it's what America was based on. It is what America takes pride in. And when we don't have it, nobody can have it. When we don't have fairness in this committee, how can they stand up and say, on the 2 weakest articles of impeachment in the history of this country, honestly, with a straight face, look at the American people and say, we did good. No, you didn't. You stained this body. You've taken this committee and made it a rubber stamp. Did any of the majority run to be a rubber stamp to get the majority? I know the minority on this side did not. You know why I know why we've become a rubber stamp? Because my chairman said so 20 years ago. He said so 20 years ago when he said, if the committee only accepts what other people give them and do not on their own verify it and thoroughly vet it, then we are nothing but a rubber stamp. Mr. Chairman, you should have run for a chairmanship, I believe, more than to be a rubber stamp for Mr. Schiff and Ms. Pelosi. We already knew this committee was overrun and overtaken because Mr. Schiff and Ms. Pelosi took it from us earlier this year. There's the first embarrassment, and the rest of it has been an embarrassment since. So as we look at this and as we go forward, we'll have plenty of time to show the complete farce of substance. But Mr. Chairman, what will live from this day is your ruling and the majority's ruling of minority rights are dead in this Congress, and especially this committee.
I want to respond to my good friend, Congressman Ciciline's comments when he said that President Trump's demand can't be explained by corruption because the word corruption is never uttered anywhere in the transcript. The problem with that is that the Democrats have built this entire fake impeachment scheme around an alleged demand. Guess what word is not anywhere in the transcript? Demand. Nowhere in that transcript does the president make a demand. Do you know where the word demand came from? It came from the whistleblower. That's the first time we heard the word demand. When he notified the Inspector General for the intelligence community, he said President Trump made a demand. He thought he could do that because he thought no one would ever be able to prove, because what president would take the unprecedented step of releasing a transcript with a foreign leader? This president did, something that the whistleblower never expected. President Trump, we keep hearing, got caught. President Trump, we keep hearing, is obstructing justice. The president that took the unprecedented step of releasing a transcript so that everyone could see the truth is not obstructing Congress. The president didn't get caught. The whistleblower got caught. The whistleblower made false statements. The whistleblower got caught with Chairman Schiff. Remember Chairman Schiff, the person that the Democrats, instead of the House Judiciary Committee, which has spent a full week on this, that's not who's been in charge. The person they put in charge was the person that got caught with the whistleblower. Have you spoken directly with the whistleblower? No, we have not. We'd like to. That wasn't true. The person that said he had evidence of the first fake impeachment scam, collusion with Russia, had evidence of that collusion and didn't have it. The person who, in the course of that, read into the record the Steele dossier because the people needed to know the truth about what happened. Well, we heard about the truth about the Steele dossier this week when the Inspector General told us it was all garbage, rubbish, all made up. Yeah, that Chairman Schiff. And now he got caught not being truthful about a whistleblower who, as I told you the other day, didn't tell the truth verbally and in writing, and that's in a transcript. You know what we didn't get in this 1 week impeachment summary Judiciary Committee? We didn't get that transcript. Chairman Schiff didn't send that one over. Only if you were on the Intelligence Committee have you seen that transcript. I've seen it. I'd like everyone to see it. I want to answer my colleague from Georgia, Mr. Johnson's question that he asked before. Is it ever okay to invite a foreign government to become involved in an election involving a political opponent? The answer is yes. It better be. We do it all the time. Have you that quickly forgotten how the Trump-Russia investigation proceeded? The Obama administration asked Great Britain and Italy and Australia and other countries to assist in its investigation of a person who was a political opponent from the opposite party. I keep hearing over and over again, you can't investigate political opponents. We have a member of this committee who was, as a member of this committee and the Intelligence Committee, investigating his political opponent, Donald Trump, at the very moment he was running to replace him as president. My colleague on the Intel Committee, Mr. Castro, was investigating President Trump at the very same moment his brother was running to replace President Trump. President Trump is the only one with the really legitimate reason to be doing it. He is the chief executive. Chief executive, we are in the Judiciary Committee, right? We do understand the Constitution. We do understand that the president, as the unitary executive, is the executive branch. And all power in the executive branch derives from the president. And the president can and should ask for assistance from foreign governments in ongoing criminal investigations. There was an ongoing criminal investigation into what happened in 2016. The Attorney General Barr, at the time of the July 25th call, had long before that appointed U.S. Attorney John Durham to investigate exactly that issue. It wasn't just appropriate, it was absolutely the president's constitutional duty. And Hunter Biden, the president has, as the chief executive, the ability to ask about matters where there is a prima facie case of corruption. What do we have with respect to Hunter Biden? Tons of money for a position where he has no Ukrainian experience, where he has no experience with Ukraine or with energy. And at the very same time that the Ukrainians were deciding that Hunter Biden was the perfect person to get that sweetheart deal, the Chinese were deciding that Hunter Biden was the perfect person to get a sweetheart deal to manage $1.5 billion in financial assets. And when the Ukrainian government wanted to investigate corruption, like we all keep talking about they need to, well, they start investigating Burisma, and what happens? Joe Biden says, you better fire that prosecutor investigating corruption into Burisma, or you're not going to get $1 billion. And 6 hours later, that's what happened. That's called influence peddling. That is a crime. And there is a prima facie case of that. And it's absolutely appropriate for a president to ask about that.
We've got to remember that the abuse of power is coming from the quid pro quo charge, which then morphed into bribery. The problem is that my colleagues across the aisle can't make out what, again, we call a prima facie case, meaning the elements are not supported by the facts. So let's just go back and look at the federal statute for bribery. The elements are as follows. Whoever being a public official corruptly demands or seeks personally anything of value in return for being influenced in the performance of an official act. Now we could tear apart each one of these elements, but let me just focus on corruptly. The president didn't have corrupt intent, and that's why the Democrats cannot make out a prima facie case. Contrary to Schiff's parody version of the July 25th call, the president wasn't asking Ukraine to, quote unquote, make up dirt about my opponent. That quote came from a parody from Chairman Schiff. The president didn't say it in the phone call. For whatever reason, that is being missed. There was also significant reason to believe that the Bidens were involved in corruption, and there's also evidence Ukrainian officials colluded with Democrats in the 26th campaign. Now, there's been a lot of talk about this being a conspiracy theory. It's not a conspiracy theory. The Hill, Politico, Financial Times all reported on this, and for whatever reason now, it's being labeled a conspiracy theory. Also, the president was not seeking to help with his 2020 campaign. Rather, he was seeking accountability regarding Ukraine Democrat collusion in 2016 and also potential corruption in the Obama administration's dealing with Ukraine as well. And we have to remember, too, what Professor Turley said. And remember, Professor Turley voted for Hillary Clinton. He is not a Trump supporter. He was very impartial. And he said, and I quote the professor, "Trump does not state a quid pro quo in the call. He's using his influence to prompt the Ukrainians to investigate and to cooperate with the Justice Department. If President Trump honestly believed there was a corrupt agreement with Hunter Biden that was not fully investigated by the Obama administration, the request for an investigation is not corrupt." And again, I was quoting Professor Turley. I'd also like to quote the Mueller report. And just an aside, we have to remember, months ago, Robert Mueller came in here and he said there was no evidence of collusion, no evidence of obstruction. But again, we're back here. Okay, let me just go back to the Mueller report. There was discussion of corruptly in that report. As it pertains to obstruction of justice, it was stated, quote, "corruptly means acting with an improper motive or with intent to obtain an improper advantage for himself or someone else, inconsistent with the official duty and the rights of others." By that standard, by Mueller's own standard, the president's behavior is entirely inconsistent with the definition of the underlying statute.
The fact that members of this committee would insinuate that Ukrainians died at the hand of Russians because they didn't get aid is absolutely ridiculous. Having actually served in a combat theater and knowing what that is like, to blame that aid was delayed a few weeks would have saved lives is frankly insulting to me and to all that served. Now Democrats want you to believe that Ukrainians died and it's Trump's fault. Why don't we impeach him on that? Members on the other side of the aisle on this committee now are talking about bribery and laying out a case for bribery and laying out elements for bribery. Yet, if their case was so compelling and overwhelming and they had all the elements, then why isn't it in the articles of impeachment? It's not in either one. They didn't include it because there's no evidence for that charge. The aid was released before the deadline set out by Congress. They released the aid. The Ukrainians didn't start any investigations. They also got a meeting with President Trump. And President Trump doesn't have to meet with foreign leaders, and he still agreed to meet with them. Article 2, Section 4 of the United States Constitution says, "The President, Vice President, and all officers shall be removed from office on the impeachment for conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors." We do not have that here. In every impeachment, Congress has interpreted this section to mean that the President has committed an actual criminal act, one that is outlined in a criminal statute. For example, Nixon, he was accused of a criminal act. Bill Clinton, 3. These were crimes that, if not tried in the House of Representatives, could have been tried in a criminal court. This standard of criminality provides clarity, and as one witness who testified before this committee, Mr. Turley, explained, although criminality is not required, clarity is necessary. That comes from a complete and comprehensive record that eliminates exculpatory motivations or explanations. But throughout this investigation, the Democrats couldn't seem to find any criminal act on the part of the president. So instead of relying on historical precedent of criminality, they decided to impeach him for abuse of power, a vague phrase that appears nowhere in the Constitution when discussing impeachment. It has no basis in fact or in evidence, but rather is deeply rooted in personal opinion and perception. Mr. Turley also explained that implications of this occurrence, quote, "We have never impeached a president solely or even largely on the basis of a non-criminal abuse of power allegation. There is good reason for that unbroken record. Abuses of power tend to be even less defined and more debatable as a basis for impeachment than some of the crimes already mentioned. He went on to say that the principal problem with proving an abuse of power theory is the lack of direct evidence due to the failure to compel key witnesses to testify or production of key documents. Now let's talk about the direct evidence that they have. There is none. The only person that would have firsthand knowledge of the quid pro quo, bribery, extortion, or whatever buzzword the Democrats want to trot out next is President Zelensky, who has categorically denied any such agreement or pressure. Herein lies the issue with hinging your entire impeachment on a non-criminal abuse of power allegation. The facts don't support your claims. So let's review. Never in the history of the United States has a president been impeached solely or largely on the basis of abuse of power. Every president who has been impeached for criminal acts. Democrats found no evidence of criminal misconduct on the part of the president. The Democrats have even failed to even prove a non-criminal standard for abuse of power and have relied on hearsay and conjecture. What the Democrats are trying to do here is pull the wool over the eyes of the American people and make them think that wrongdoing has occurred where there is none. By using fancy rhetoric and flowery language, they think that they can convince a nation of their ill-conceived ideas. Don't fall for it.
Mr. Swalwell's comments that there are definitely crimes in this situation. First of all, I believe Mr. Swalwell, during the Mueller investigation, went on national TV and said something to the effect of an indictment is coming. He knew it. An indictment is coming. So I know Mr. Swalwell knows crimes. He was a prosecutor. And he also knows the obligation that a prosecutor has not to bring a crime, not to bring a charge unless there's a reasonable probability of conviction. I would direct Mr. Swalwell to the elements of bribery. Whoever, being a public official, corruptly demands or seeks personally anything of value in return for being influenced in the performance of an official act. The Department of Justice's Criminal Division Public Integrity Section opined in September that something as nebulous as an investigation is not of sufficient concrete value to constitute something of value under this statute. They also, the other element that is at question here, and one of the reasons I think that we need more than 1 week as the committee of jurisdiction to look into this matter, is because if there are crimes, we should be bringing experts, we should be bringing in testimony, and if there is a crime, I think it is far more fair to charge pass articles of impeachment on a president where the president can defend against specific elements as opposed to something as vague as abuse of power. Mr. Swalwell, the official act that you talk about under the McConnell, Supreme Court's McConnell decision, that decision says setting up a meeting, talking to another official, or organizing an event without more does not fit the definition of official act. There are 2 elements missing in your analysis, but that doesn't surprise me because there were no elements that were that the special counsel found in this situation. I think that it is unfortunate when the gentleman from Rhode Island talks about the president sending Mr. Giuliani to the Ukraine to smear Vice President Biden. Let's talk about what Vice President Biden did. His son sat on a board and made an outrageous amount of money for someone that had no background in energy, no background in the Ukraine, while his father was the vice president. If that is not a fair topic for discussion in the world of politics, I don't know what is. Smearing is trying to conjure up false information or making a vague argument based on false information. This isn't smearing. This is seeking the truth about corruption. Not a single member on the other side of the aisle has been willing to condemn the conduct of the former vice president. How frustrating it must be to be President Trump and have your son spend over $1 million on attorney's fees when the special counsel is investigating something that never happened. There was no collusion. There was no conspiracy between Russia and the Trump campaign. But there is clear evidence of wrongdoing between Hunter Biden, the former Vice President Joe Biden.
Would the gentleman yield?
No, I will not. And the Ukraine and the corporation Burisma. So the idea that there is a smear going on, let's look at the facts.
My amendment would strike all of Article 2, which is the obstruction of Congress charge. The facts simply do not align with the Democrats' claim of obstruction. Our government has three branches for a reason. When there is a disagreement between the executive and the legislative branch, it is supposed to be resolved by the third branch, the court. Republicans recognized this in 2011 when they investigated President Obama's Fast and Furious scandal. The Fast and Furious scandal allowed 2,000 firearms to fall into the hands of drug cartels and resulted in the death of an American Border Patrol agent. People actually died in President Obama's scandal. Throughout the Republicans' investigation of that scandal, they made numerous attempts to accommodate the Obama administration. Yet despite their efforts, President Obama invoked executive privilege and barred testimony and documents. So what did the Republicans do? The appropriate thing. They went to the courts. Compare those efforts with what we have seen from the Democrats during this impeachment sham. House Democrats could have worked with the administration to reach accommodations for their requests, but they didn't. House Democrats should have worked through the courts, but they didn't. And why is that? It's simple. Because they have a political expedient deadline to send this mess out of Congress into the Senate before Christmas. So despite what you hear from my colleagues, the administration has consistently cooperated with Democrats, even though they have been out to get this president since the very moment he was elected. Let's just go through the numbers. Over 25 administration officials have testified before the House Oversight Committee. Over 25. Over 20 administration officials have testified before this very committee. The administration has also handed over more than 100,000 pages of documents since the start of this sham impeachment inquiry. Now let's contrast that with the conduct from the Democrats. Democrats have threatened witnesses that, quote unquote, any failure to appear in response to a letter requesting their presence would constitute evidence of obstruction. Let me just go through that language. It's a letter would constitute evidence of obstruction. That's not a subpoena, that's a letter. Democrats have also told the State Department employees that if they insisted on using agency counsel to protect executive branch confidentiality interests, they would have their salaries withheld. That kind of sounds like abuse of power, but I digress a little bit. Democrats have not afforded this president basic procedure protections, such as the right to see all the evidence, the right to call witnesses, or the right to have counsel at hearings. But it's just not the Trump administration that's been railroaded by the Democrats. Judiciary Democrats voted down my own subpoena, my own motion to subpoena the whistleblower, even though I said that he or she could testify in executive session, which would be private, and yet they voted it down on party lines. Chairman Nadler also refused requests to have Chairman Schiff testify before this committee. House Democrats also have denied every Republican request for a fact witness. So I ask, who is really obstructing Congress? The Democrats have no case when it comes to obstruction. This obstruction charge is completely baseless and bogus. If they really wanted to charge someone with obstruction, how about they start with Adam Schiff?